Tick-tock, time to rock. I believe that we are live. Always wait a few seconds to see if I can see our lovely faces and hear the melodious sounds of our voices. And there we are. All right. So good evening and good morning and good afternoon to all the Christians and the Jews and the Muslims and the atheists and the agnostics and the Hindus and the Buddhists and yes, even you Wiccans who are watching all around the world. And we know you can't stay away because when people hear that David Wood and Robert Spencer got something going down, they can't stay away. I'm David Wood, your friendly neighborhood philosopher, and with me is the man who literally wrote the book on the history of jihad, Robert Spencer. Let's see it, Robert. The History of Jihad, from Muhammad to ISIS. Awesome book that should be in everyone's library. I believe I put it down. I believe I put the link in the description box. If you don't have that, you're going to want to get it. And you'll see why during this program. You'll see why everyone needs to learn this information. The primary reason everyone needs to learn this information is that there is an entire world of people who are trying to mislead the population, mislead the public about the history of jihad. Now, Robert, why would anyone want to do something like that?
For political purposes in the present day, David, the primary reason why we have all this rewriting of history nowadays and historical whitewashing and revisionism absolutely rampant today is because there are political agendas that certain people think that they can help advance by manipulating history and by making people think, for example, that Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain, was such a paradise of tolerance and multiculturalism that to bring large numbers of Muslims into Europe today is a grand thing, because that same paradise of mutual respect and harmony among the religions, or at least the three great Abrahamic religions, will recur, and Europe will march proudly and confidently into the glorious mosaic of the multicultural future. Now, if in contrast to that, Al-Andalus was actually a very terrible place for Jews and Christians, and they were subjugated under the rule of Islamic law, and they were never equals with the Muslims, and there was nothing multicultural or harmonious about Al-Andalus, but it was, as I show in the history of jihad, a center of the Islamic slave trade and a place where Christians and Jews were horribly oppressed and subjected to violence if they got out of line. All that history has to be covered up and whitewashed so that people don't get the idea that, oh no, letting in mass numbers of Muslims into Europe is a bad idea. Because while some of them will be lovely people, others might think exactly that. Hey, let's reestablish Al-Andalus and establish the hegemony of Islam over Europe. And that would be very bad, actually, and make life very difficult and painful for the non-Muslims in Europe.
Yeah, I've heard that too, about the golden age of Islam, when Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived in complete harmony under Islamic rule in Spain. And maybe, uh-oh, I see you flipping through your book there.
Yeah, you see, got some Post-its in here because I wanted to make sure to emphasize a few places where there was trouble for the non-Muslims.
Oh, and yeah. As far as and we're gonna. By the way, everyone, just so you know how this live stream came about, I saw some of the silliest tweets I've ever seen in my entire life, and I went ahead and forwarded them to Robert, and I said, "You want to respond to some of these because I mean these are just pure Twitter gold right here." And he said, "Yeah, let's go live." But I mean, it's just amazing that, I mean, it seems like this is the situation. It seems like the apologists for Islam, who are both Muslim and non-Muslim, seems like the apologists for Islam, the people who want to defend Islam, it seems like they always try to aim for an area of ignorance for most of the population, right? Like at first it's, oh, Muhammad was peaceful. Muhammad had all these peaceful teachings. If you just read the Muslim sources, you find out that Muhammad was really, really peaceful. But people started doing that, right? And so that wasn't working out. Or they would say, oh, the vast majority of Muslims in the world today are basically no different from you in ideology, and they just want freedom and tolerance and democracy and so on. And then we see things like ISIS springing up. We see the problems all around the world. And then we actually see statistics coming out on the percentages of Muslims who support killing apostates and honor killings and things like that, and we realize, whoa, this isn't just a tiny minority here. These are massive portions of the population. In many places, there are majorities of the populations that support things like killing apostates and stuff like that. So that's not going to work. And so now the tactic is to go to some place in history that they know people don't study, right? They know that people today, no one, if you're not working on your PhD in history, in a very narrow field. No one is studying, the golden age of Islam in Spain. No one's studying that. And so it allows them to say whatever they want. So at first they could say whatever they want about Muhammad. Then some people started looking into that and showing them that they're lying. Then they wanted to say things about the Muslim population of the world today. And then actual studies were done and showed that they were lying. And now they're going to various periods of history that no one is studying and no one knows anything about. And they're lying about those things. And what's the solution here?
Tell the truth. And David, this has been going on for a long time. I'm an old man now, David, and I remember way back, you were probably in knee socks, but this book, The Ornament of the World by Maria Rosa Menocal, came out, and she was a respected historian. And The Ornament of the World is, as far as I know, the first attempt to whitewash Muslim Spain. I don't remember exactly when the book came out, but I know that I was in the bloom of youth, and you probably were just a twinkling in the eye. In any case, the myth that was propagated by this book, The Ornament of the World, has gone all around the world twice. Barack Hussein Obama, president of the United States, former president of the United States, he said in his outreach speech in Cairo, outreach to the Muslim world on June 4th, 2009, he said, Islam has a proud tradition of tolerance. We see it in the history of Andalusia. Now, what's interesting about that is that Maria Rosa Menocal's book actually has more of a reputation for saying something than it actually says it. People assumed way back when it came out, that she was showing that there was a wonderful time of tolerance and multiculturalism and peace between the Muslims and the Christians and the Jews in Spain. But if you actually read her book, she said this: the dhimmi, as these covenanted peoples were called, and of course, as we know, that's the subjugated people who are willingly submitting to the Muslims and feeling themselves subdued, as per the Quran, chapter 9, verse 29, were granted religious freedom, not forced to convert to Islam. They could continue to be Jews and Christians, she says, and as it turned out, they could share in much of Muslim social and economic life. But then the other shoe drops. She goes on. In return for this freedom of religious conscience, the peoples of the book, pagans had no such privilege, were required to pay a special tax. No Muslims paid taxes, and to observe a number of restrictive regulations. Christians and Jews were prohibited from attempting to proselytize Muslims, from building new places of worship, from displaying crosses or ringing bells. In some, they were forbidden most public displays of their religious rituals. Now, that's just Menocal. She really is whitewashing the situation. It's actually much harsher than that. There is a harrowing scene that is recounted by the Muslim historian Ibn Hayyan, who's writing in the 10th century. And he's writing about Abdurrahman III, who was the Umayyad Caliph of Cordoba. And he said that at one point, just for no reason except to strike terror in the hearts of the enemies of Allah, as the Quran directs in chapter 8, verse 60, he says that one of the officers of Abdurrahman III chose 100 of the most important barbarians, and by that he means the Christians, and sent them to the Alcázar of Cordoba, where they arrived on March 2nd, 939, and then they were marched to where the caliph was, And on conclusion of the Friday prayer, many gathered and followed to see what end the prisoners would have. And it turned out that An-Nasir was installed on the upper balcony over the orchard facing the river to watch the execution. All the prisoners, one by one, were decapitated in his presence and under his eyes, in plain, in plain sight of the people, whose feelings against the infidels Allah alleviated, which, as you know, is an allusion to the Quran, chapter 9, verse 14, which says, fight them, and Allah will punish them through your hands, and thereby soothe the bosoms of the believers. That is, if you're sad or depressed or anxious or upset, you can fight the unbelievers and you'll feel better. And so this is what Ibn Hayyan says. The feelings of the believers were alleviated against the infidels by Allah when they saw them all being killed. Now, mind you, these people didn't do anything. They were just Christians, and it was for the fact of being Christians. This is daily life in Al-Andalusia. There's much more, but the point is that these tweets that you've got, which we need to get to, I understand, and these people who say that the history is all whitewashed, they are banking on us not knowing the history. And so in this book, I went back to the primary sources, and I show that again and again, really everywhere that Muslims have gone throughout history, they have been violent and uncharitable, discriminatory, and they have persecuted the non-Muslims everywhere they have gone without exception.
Now, before everyone accuses you of saying something, do you mean all Muslims?
I do not. I mean that wherever they went, some of them did. Mm-hmm. And you know what? The others who didn't, they didn't stop them. A lot of people nowadays, they say militant Islam is the problem. Moderate Islam is the solution. Of course, that's the famous slogan of our friend Daniel Pipes. But the problem with it is that there is no moderate Islam. There are Muslims who do not observe all of the tenets of the Quran and Sunnah, but there has never been throughout history, anywhere, a moderate Muslim movement of Muslims who were going to stand up and stop other Muslims from being violent and hateful toward non-Muslims. That never happened. And so if we're staking our future in the West on that possibility, it's wishful thinking. There's no historical precedent for it.
Yeah, along those lines, I remember an ABC special where they said that our first line of defense against terrorists are the peaceful Muslims who are going to stand between the radical Muslims who want to kill us and us. And they were our first line of defense. And as they just randomly filmed some Muslims in the city of New York, they recorded as one of their examples of a peaceful Muslim who's going to protect us, Sadiq Abdul Malik, who was speaking with the group Revolution Muslim, several members of whom were charged with terrorist offenses. These were the guys who threatened Matt Stone and Trey Parker from South Park, right? That's what these guys were arrested for. And so just randomly filming some examples of Muslims in the city of New York to show, hey, these are the guys who are going to stand up for you. They couldn't help but accidentally getting an actual jihadi, right? And so,
you remember, David, right after 9/11, the New York Times did a profile of a moderate imam in the United States who they said was working tirelessly to stand against terrorism, and it was Anwar al-Awlaki.
Oh, yeah.
And Muhammad, Biography of a Prophet, which was the big BBC documentary on Muhammad. For many years, it was available for free on YouTube. And then I pointed out that there was a profile of a Muslim congressional staffer. And as they are interviewing this Muslim congressional staffer, he goes off to Friday prayers on Capitol Hill. And when he goes to Friday prayers on Capitol Hill, Ibrahim Hooper and Nihad Awad of the Council on American Islamic Relations, and Randall Royer, who was then of the Council, Ismail Royer, who was then of the Council on American Islamic Relations, and then served 15 years for plotting jihad terror in Kashmir, 15 years in prison, that is. They're all there for Friday prayers, and the camera pans back, and you see the imam preaching, and it's Anwar al-Awlaki. And so I think that they took that off YouTube because I started to make fun of them about it. But that once again illustrates that even when the establishment media goes to find moderates, they end up finding people who are anything but, and they don't even realize.
Yeah, interesting stuff here. All right, so let's go ahead and take a peek at one of these tweets here. This first one will be from Dr. Craig Considine. And Robert, if I remember correctly, we've actually dealt with Dr. Considine many times in the past. I think we were dealing with him when he was still like a graduate student way back in the day. You recall that?
Yeah, he was writing for the Huffington Post. I don't know if he was a graduate student then or whatever he was, but yeah, I think you're right. Actually, I think he was, incidentally, he was a student, as far as I recall, if I recall correctly. Dr. Considine, please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember that he was a student of Akbar Ahmed, who is a professor at American University in Washington, and he is a very respected academic, and he just wrote a book called Journey into Europe, where, and this brings us right back home, he recommended that Europe, in its present condition of strife regarding Muslim migration, adopt the Andalusian model and establish a new Andalusia. And so he's presenting Akbar Ahmed Andalusia as the way forward for Europe, this paradise of multiculturalism, which it never was. And Craig Considine was his eager acolyte and product of his mentoring. And he wrote an article comparing Muhammad with George Washington, which was the occasion of one of your wonderful early imaginative forays before you became a Muslim in the Islamicize Me series last year.
Yeah, those were fun times.
Yes, I interviewed George Washington, and we discussed whether you were really that close to Muhammad or not.
Yeah, George Washington was pretty outraged at being compared to Muhammad. All right, let's go ahead and read this tweet by Dr. Considine. And so this is a guy who's a professor of sociology now, and this is what he's telling the next generation. He says Christians and Muslims have always strong terms there. Christians, always. Matter of fact, I need to read it more like he's writing it. Christians and Muslims have always managed to coexist peacefully around the world, the entire world. Always managed to coexist peacefully around the world. Places of worship have been respected. So there are a couple claims here, Robert. We're going to want you to address these. So we have one, that Christians and Muslims have always managed to coexist peacefully around the world. And next, places of worship have been respected and freedom of religion granted by both populations. Too often we forget these historical facts. So it's a historical fact.
Historical facts.
That Christians and Muslims have always managed to coexist peacefully around the world, and that places of worship have been respected, and that freedom of religion has been granted by both populations. People forget this. People keep forgetting this historical fact, and hence the need to educate on these moments in time is a top priority. It is a top priority to educate people on these historical facts. Robert?
I'm all for educating people. You want some education, David? I got some for you here.
Oh, yeah. Because I agree with him that people need to be educated about the facts here. We just seem to have a little bit of a slight, tiny little disagreement on what the facts are here.
Okay, now I'm just going to read one thing. Of course, I could just read this book all night, and it says the same thing on every page, but...
Oh, looks like we faded out for a second.
Uh-oh.
All right, so you were asking about what...
what houses of worship.
What Dr. Considine said. So places of worship have been respected and freedom of religion granted by both populations.
Okay, I'm going to read this. This is from 1360. In 1360, the Muslim ruler Firuz Shah Tughlaq in India, the Sultan of Delhi, he resumed the jihad against the Hindus, targeting the grand Hindu temple, the temple of Jagannath at Puri in southeastern India. And according to a Muslim historian, Barani, who wrote a history of the rule of Firuz Shah, he said this, Allah, who is the only God and has no other emanation, endowed the king of Islam with the strength to destroy this ancient shrine on the eastern seacoast and to plunge it into the sea. And after its destruction, Firuz Shah ordered the image of Jagannath, the Hindu god, to be perforated and disgraced it by casting it down on the ground. They dug out other idols, which were worshipped by the polytheists in the kingdom of Jajnagar, and overthrew them as they did the image of Jagannath for being laid in front of the mosques along the path of the Sunnis and the way of the Musallis, that's the people going in for prayer, and stretched them in front of the portals of every mosque so that the body and sides of the image might be trampled at the time of ascent and descent, entrance and exit, by the shoes on the feet of the Muslims, which of course you know is a great insult, the bottom of the foot. To show it and certainly to trample on something is to show your utmost contempt and hatred for it in Islamic culture. Now, that's not just one incident. All through the history of the jihad in India, they always tore down the temples, thousands of Hindu temples, thousands, and would regularly take the Hindu idols, break them in pieces, and put the pieces in front of the mosques so that they would be trampled by the Muslims on their way in and out of the mosques. This is the respect for the houses of worship in India. Of course, also closer to home, we know, where is the Temple Mount? Where is the Dome of the Rock, rather? Where is the Al-Aqsa Mosque? They're on the Temple Mount. What is the Temple Mount? The site of the great temple of the Jews. Why did they build two mosques, not just one, but two mosques on the site of the Jewish temple to show Islam's victory over Judaism? What is the Hagia Sophia? It's a grand mosque in Constantinople, Istanbul. When was it built? In the 6th century. Islam did not exist in the 6th century. The Hagia Sophia was a cathedral until the Muslims conquered Constantinople in 1453. Why was it turned into a mosque? Because the Muslims, it was the greatest church in the Christian world, and the Muslims wanted to show the victory of Islam over Christianity. This is the respect for the houses of worship we're talking about. And I could multiply examples by the thousands.
So, and by the way, doesn't this go back to the time of Muhammad, with Muhammad taking over the Kaaba, smashing all the idols, showing utter contempt for the religious beliefs of the pagans of Mecca?
That's right. Absolutely. There were 360 idols in the Kaaba, and he is said to have cleared out every one of them except an icon, a Byzantine icon of Jesus and Mary. Did you see that when you were in there?
Oh, as far as Dr. Considine?
No, when you were in the Kaaba.
Oh, no, okay. No, no, it's not there anymore.
I wonder when they took it out.
Someone took it down. But we know various groups have sort of had their way with the Kaaba over time. Various Muslim groups who are accusing other Muslim groups of idolatry and so on. So someone took that picture out. All right, now, so when you pointed out, turning churches into mosques, you said that there are examples by the thousands. So yes. Give us the sort of geography of where this was happening over the centuries.
All over the place, everywhere Islam conquered, they converted churches into mosques. For example, North Africa was a thriving center of Christianity when the Muslims conquered. Some of the greatest figures of the early church, I know Protestants think of the early church as the church of the New Testament, but Catholics and Orthodox tend to think of the early church as the church of the first centuries. And St. Cyprian, who was in the middle part of the 3rd century, St. Augustine of Hippo, which was in North Africa near Carthage, was in the 5th century, the latter part of the 4th and the early part of the 5th century, died in 430. And they were both North Africans. They were members of the North African Church. Now, the North African Church, the Church of Carthage, was a very considerable church in the early years. Of course, to say nothing of Egypt, the Church of Alexandria was the 3rd see. The Council of Chalcedon, the 4th Ecumenical Council, said that the precedence of the patriarchal churches was Rome, and then with equal privileges, Constantinople, and 3rd Alexandria. So it was the 3rd most important church in the Christian world in North Africa. Now, there are still churches in Egypt, but when you go farther into Libya, where Carthage was, in Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco. That was all Christian land. There were thousands of churches in those areas. They're all gone. There aren't even traces of them for the most part. A few years back, going over to the Middle East, you had a few years back, Pope Benedict XVI went to Syria and he entered the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus along with Muslim leaders. And it was kind of controversial that the Pope was going into a mosque. But actually, that mosque was the Church of St. John the Baptist and was also one of the foremost churches in the Christian world. The Hagia Sophia I mentioned that was conquered by the Muslims in 1453. And after that, the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople moved to the Church of the Pamakaristos, which was another church in Constantinople. And that was his headquarters until 1591, when it too was seized by the Ottoman Sultan and converted to a mosque, which it remains. Now, although some of these, the Hagia Sophia and the Pamakaristos, were made into museums later under the secular Turks, there's a considerable push under Erdogan now to convert the Hagia Sophia at least back to a mosque. In any case, nobody's talking about making it into a church again, as one might expect if Craig Considine were right and Muslims were very concerned to be tolerant of other religions. Then one would think that out of this tolerance, generosity, multicultural, and ecumenical spirit that they would offer the Hagia Sophia to the Ecumenical Patriarch and allow him to restore it as a church.
So if you were talking about Muslims as they spread east and met with Hindus, they would destroy their temples, smash their idols, and place their idols outside the mosque so that they would trample them under feet as they're going. That's a situation in the east. And then in the west, where Muslims were encountering Christianity, they were seizing their churches and converting them into mosques. Can we say that the true pattern, contrary to what Dr. Considine says, the true pattern that we find in Islam is utter contempt for places of worship of the non-Muslims? And that, is there really anywhere where Muslims were in control that they showed respect for a period of centuries for the places of worship of the unbelievers?
No, the Islamic law forbids Christians to build new churches or repair old ones. So the idea is that their churches get older and older and more dilapidated, and they're not allowed to repair them. And this remains even in Egypt. Egypt is not a Sharia state, but these things are so much part of the culture in the Islamic world that Muslims have rioted on more than one occasion in recent years when the Coptic Christians in Egypt have tried to repair old churches or build new ones. The idea is that the dhimmis are supposed to be in a perpetual state of decline, and that the Islamic community is always expanding at the expense of the non-Muslim population. So there's never been any respect for the sacred places of the non-Muslims. I mean, even when Hagia Sophia was made into a museum and it was opened up for non-Muslims to go in, I wish I had I don't have it right at hand, but there's a very famous Byzantine icon that's from the Hagia Sophia of an icon of Jesus. It's a very famous image, but if you look at it, it's a mosaic icon, and quite a lot of the tiles have fallen off. And the thing is in an elaborate, advanced state of disrepair. The Turkish government, even as a secular government, has never shown any concern for the advanced state of disrepair of these famous images, or has made any attempt or any offer to allow Christians to come in and restore them or to care for them or at the very least try to halt their decay. They just don't have any interest in those things whatsoever.
All right. Now, as far as the claim that Christians and Muslims have always lived together in peace, people can go to Dr. Considine's Twitter page and see this comment. One of the things that I noticed was that when people disagreed with him, the most common response he got in disagreement, to show people disagreeing with him, to show, no, Christians and Muslims haven't always gotten along peacefully. The main response was, wrong, the Crusades. Now, as someone who has studied the history of jihad from the time of Muhammad down to the present, how disheartening is it? How disheartening is it for you to think that when people want to think of a time when Christianity and Islam didn't get along, their main example, the only thing they can think of, the only thing in their minds is, but the Crusades, when these Christians went out and attacked the peaceful Muslims, this shows that they didn't always get along peacefully. So you're wrong, Dr. Constantine. How disheartening is that, Robert?
Well, David, I'm kind of used to historical illiteracy, especially among Americans. I'm trying to work against it, but I understand it's an uphill battle when the public schools, the private schools, the Catholic schools, the Christian schools all teach this nonsense, and people just take it for granted. It's astonishing to me that even these very simple facts about the Crusades aren't known. But if people wanted to pick up the history of jihad, they could read it all. In the year 1071, what happened was, let me start a little earlier. In the year 632, Muhammad died. 636, 637, the Muslims start to pour out of Arabia. They conquered Jerusalem very quickly, Antioch, two major cities that were centers of Christendom at that point, patriarchal sees of the church. They conquered Egypt and North Africa very, very quickly, and they were always oppressive to the non-Muslims, to the Christians in those countries. Now, this was all jihad warfare. By 732, 100 years after Muhammad is supposed to have died, you have a massive Islamic empire stretching from the Pyrenees between Spain and France all the way across North Africa, encompassing the Middle East and Persia and going into India. And in that massive empire, nowhere do the Christians or any other non-Muslims have equal rights with the Muslims or are respected by the Muslims. Nowhere. Now,
So hang on. Dr. Constantine is saying it's everywhere, and you're saying it's actually nowhere.
Right. I'll debate him on this. He can't show me a single example. He's just relying on the ignorance, the historical ignorance of the American people, which is vast for the most part. But the thing is, if you're looking for violence between religions, it's all coming from the Muslim side. The Muslims, sometimes the Christians fight back. They fought back in France and drove the Muslims from France when the Muslims lost the Battle of Tours in 732. Charles the Hammer and all that, Charles Martel. But most of the time, there was no significant pushback. And what had been half of the Christian world is gone and is conquered and Islamized. There's no response. So what happened in the year 1071? The Byzantine Empire, which was a Christian empire, Christianity is the official religion, and the citizens of the empire are expected to be Christian, and most of them are. In the year 1071 at Manzikert in what is now eastern Turkey, eastern Anatolia, eastern Asia Minor, the Byzantine army, led by the emperor himself, was smashed, not just defeated, but absolutely ruined, destroyed by the Seljuk Turks. And Anatolia, which was the breadbasket of the Byzantine Empire, the farmland, the means of its support, the means of its nourishment, lay open to conquest by the Turks and was swiftly conquered by the Turks. The emperor was captured and he was released by the Sultan because he asked him, it's in the book, the Sultan asks him, what would you have done if the shoe had been on the other foot and you'd captured me? And he said, well, I probably would have killed you. And the Sultan says, I'm going to do even worse to you. I'm going to release you. And he does. And he sends him back to Constantinople, where he was blinded and deposed. So the new emperor, Alexius Comnenus, is thoroughly alarmed at this situation, sees the imminent end of the Christian Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire. So he appeals to the West. Now, that was extraordinary, too, because this is just a few decades after the Great Schism, the split between the Church of Rome and the Church of Constantinople, or what we know today as the Roman Catholic Church and the Greek Orthodox Church. The Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church have been at odds, sometimes quite bitter ever since then. The schism has not been healed, even though there's been quite a bit of reconciliation. But he was still appealing to the Pope, who was the foremost authority in Western Europe in those days, and asking for help. This took quite a while to bring about, but it was 1095, almost a quarter century later, that Pope Urban II called the First Crusade for the defense of the Byzantine Empire and the defense of Christians who were wanting to make pilgrimages in the Holy Land, where they were being attacked, murdered outright, or enslaved by the Muslims. And so the Crusades came about as a defensive reaction to these Islamic conquests, and that's what they were originally conceived as. Certainly the Crusaders did some things that nobody can support, that I do not support, and nobody should support. But the idea that they were the beginning of the hostility, or the only time that Muslims and Christians have not gotten along, is absolutely ahistorical. There were 450 years of jihad conquest before the Crusades that were never responded to by the Christians, and set a pattern of rapacious jihad advances into Christian territory that only stopped for the 200 years that the Crusaders were actually in the Holy Land, and then resumed after they were finally driven out and the last Crusader domain conquered in the year 1291.
Two things worthy of note there. One, it's just amazing that I think your average Westerner still thinks of the Crusades as Christian aggression against peaceful Muslims who are minding their own business in the Middle East, and not a response to 450 years of jihad against Christendom. Right. And the Christians just sit there and sit there and sit there and sit there and sit there, and finally they react. And then all we remember is the reaction, and we remember it as aggression. But two,
9/11. Bill Clinton was no longer president, but he made a speech saying all this started back when the Crusades drove a wedge between the Muslims and the Christians. And people, I think, generally think that that's really when it all happened.
And so there's that. And then second, in your book, you acknowledge atrocities committed by the Western Christians during the Crusades, right? So you are able to say, look, you have to condemn where condemnation is due, and these things were wrong. So it's just amazing that that there is one side in this entire discussion which always has to misrepresent and distort and pretend that things that happened didn't happen, and the side that's called the liars, namely you're the side that's called a liar. You're the one who's basically telling people what happened on both sides and giving sources for everything you're saying.
Well, yeah, David, I write on the firing line. I'm not able to be I don't even know how to put it. I can't relax. That's all. I mean, in a professional sense. In a personal sense, I relax plenty, but in the professional sense, I can never just say these things happened, because I know that everything I say can and will be used against me, and anything I say in terms of history or Islamic doctrine will be challenged. Now, most of the time nowadays, actually, it's more ignored. There was no Muslim review of the history of jihad. What are they going to say? Because I very carefully document everything. It's all footnoted. Everybody can check up on me. And this is true in all my work. So the reality is that I don't have the luxury of being able to throw things out like Craig Considine. Craig Considine has a ready audience of these people who think because he's aligned with them ideologically and politically that therefore he's trustworthy. But I know that I'm going out in front of a hostile crowd. And so everything that is in the history of jihad, everything that's in all my other books is very carefully documented, and anybody can check and see that it is actually the case. And I rely for the most part on primary sources, on contemporary historians. And they think it's very important that if people want to get out of this fog of misinformation and disinformation that envelops us all today, Go back to the primary sources. Don't read my books if you don't want, but go back to what historians of the day said had happened, and they don't have any reason to color the situation, especially if they're Muslims. Read Muslim historians who wrote about the Crusades and who wrote about the jihads before and after the Crusades, and see what they say. It's illuminating. It'll be quite eye-opening to people who've listened to Craig Considine and Akbar Ahmed and those that ilk.
All right, so we want to take one more look at Craig Considine's tweet here, just to see if there's well, I wanted to quickly review something real quick before we go on to the tweet by the Yaqeen Institute. So Christians and Muslims have always managed to coexist peacefully. That's false. Around the world. That's false. Places of worship have been respected. That's
Never.
false. And freedom of religion granted by both populations. That's false. He calls them historical facts. That's false. And the need to educate on these moments in time is a top priority, and then gets over 1,000 likes almost instantly on this tweet. But just even if you didn't know a lot of the details that are in your book, even if you didn't know a lot of the details about the specific battles and the wars and the specific churches and so on, and whether you're talking about East or West, it just seems like if you know anything at all, you'd have to think, okay, Muhammad starts off in Arabia and takes over the Middle East, goes all the way across northern Africa, takes over a massive portion of a very large continent, then works his way into Europe. That's in the West. And then in the East, goes all the way through the Middle East, all the way through the places that are now Iran and Afghanistan and Pakistan into India. And the idea that Islam got all of this by peaceful coexistence and getting along and respecting places of worship is idiotic. I mean, you'd have to be the dumbest person in the world. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt, David, but just to clarify one thing, as you had said before with me, just to make sure nobody thinks you said what you didn't say, said what you didn't say. You said Muhammad conquered all those areas, but of course it was the Muslims after Muhammad who conquered those areas. Yep. If Muhammad indeed was ever really with us at all.
Yeah. So Muhammad took over most of Arabia, but his followers carry it on. The idea that his message and teachings and religion spread over continent after continent, multiple continents here, and didn't stop until they were physically stopped by people who physically stopped them. The idea that they gained all of this territory, won all of this territory across 3 continents through peace and tolerance is, you'd have to be an utter moron to believe that for a second. And yet that's just popular. It's just popular to claim that, and it's popular to like that, and it's popular to agree with that despite the absurdity. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the world we live in.
Telling people what they want to hear is a big business.
Gotta love it. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at this tweet from the Yaqeen Institute. Here we go, Robert. Be prepared to be refuted now. So the Yaqeen Institute tweeted out, religious minorities are often depicted as historically oppressed and vulnerable victims of their Muslim rulers. This portrayal, however, is far from accurate. And then there's an infographic there that explains everything. We might have to go through that separately someday. But religious minorities are often depicted as historically oppressed and vulnerable victims of their Muslim rulers. So whether we're talking about Hindus or Buddhists or Zoroastrians or pagans or Christians or Jews, when these groups are minorities in Muslim-controlled areas, people often portray them as vulnerable victims of the Muslim rulers. However, this portrayal is not accurate. And Robert, I have to say, you're one of the people who are portraying these religious minorities as victims of their Muslim rulers. You have it right there from the Yaqeen Institute, who would have no reason to make things up, who would have absolutely no reason to make any of this up. You, however, do, because you're an Islamophobe. How would you attempt to defend what you've said?
Well, let's go back to 1066. A very good year. Good year in Britain. Good year all over the world. And in the year 1066, here is an example of Islamic tolerance. David, a Jew named Samuel ibn Nagrila, became the friends of the Muslim rulers of Granada in Spain, Muslim Spain. And he and his son Joseph even attained some power. Joseph ibn Nagrila was actually named the vizier of Granada by the Muslim ruler. Now, this is a case of rules were made to be broken. This is a case of a Muslim ruler ignoring Islamic law, which forbids non-Muslims to hold authority over Muslims, because he liked Samuel ibn Nagrila and his son Joseph. And so he gave them political power. But the other Muslims in the area, they knew Islamic law as well, and they were not interested in ignoring it. A poet named Abu Ishaq wrote a poem, and he wrote this. I'll just read some segments of it. Through him, that is this vizier, the Jews, not the vizier, I'm sorry, the Muslim ruler, through him the Jews have become great and proud and arrogant. They who were among the most abject, and they have gained their desires and attained the utmost, and this happens suddenly. And how many a worthy Muslim humbly obeys the vilest ape among these miscreants? Of course, we know the Quran calls Jews apes and pigs, and so there they go, doing it again. Their chief ape has marbled his house and led the finest spring water to it. Our affairs are now in his hands, and we stand at his door. He laughs at Allah and our religion. So, what does Abu Ishaq say should be done? Hasten to slaughter him as an offering. Sacrifice him. Do not consider it a breach of faith to kill the Jews. The breach of faith would be to let them carry on. And 4,000 Jews were killed by Muslims in Granada, December 30th, 1066.
So, but they obviously weren't victims of Islamic oppressors, because the Yaqeen Institute says that that's just a misrepresentation of history.
Okay. Let's see. How about this? This is the Muslim conquest of the city of Ani in Armenia.
Hang on. It looks like you're just randomly flipping through your book and pointing to
wherever.
stuff.
I just hit on this one. I don't have this one on a post-it note. I just happened to catch my eye. The 13th century Muslim historian, David, Sibt ibn al-Jawzi. And he says this: the army entered the city. Now, you'd think when a Muslim army enters a Christian city, they're going to have garlands of flowers for the women, shake the hands of the men, and offer them to buy them lunch or something. Am I right? Mm-hmm. But this is what actually happened. These people apparently misunderstood Islam. They massacred its inhabitants, pillaged and burned it, leaving it in ruins and taking prisoners all who remained alive. The dead bodies were so many that they blocked the streets. One could not go anywhere without stepping over them. And the number of prisoners was not less than 50,000 souls. I was determined to enter the city. This is an eyewitness. I was determined to enter the city and see the destruction with my own eyes. I tried to find a street in which I would not have to walk over the corpses, but that was impossible.
Huh. Well, somehow it must have been peaceful. I mean, it must have been. Now, Robert, a couple of people over in the chat have brought up the Armenian genocide.
I got that in the book.
Oh, you do?
Yes. Fear not. The Armenian genocide began in 1894. And this was, of course, in the Ottoman Empire. It started really with the Greek independence in 1821. And when the Greeks in the Morea, which is the peninsula, the southern peninsula of what is Greece today, when they won their independence, then a lot of the other non-Muslims in the Ottoman Empire started to get ideas. And the Islamic law, of course, would consider the non-Muslims who were rebelling against the Islamic leaders, they have forfeited the dhimma, their contract of protection, and so they can lawfully be killed. Okay, So Armenian genocide starts when the Armenians won independence, and this is the kind of thing that happened. The German historian Johannes Lepsius, this is 1896, he's actually there in the Ottoman Empire, in Armenia, and he says this. He says, "We have lists before us of 559 villages whose surviving inhabitants were converted to Islam with fire and sword, of 568 churches thoroughly pillaged, destroyed, and razed to the ground, 282 Christian churches transformed into mosques, 21 Protestant preachers, and 170 Armenian priests who were, after enduring unspeakable tortures, murdered on their refusal to accept Islam. We repeat, however," Lepsius says, "that those figures express only the extent of our information and do not by a long way reach to the extent of reality." He says the Muslims had destroyed 2,500 Christian villages, the entire villages, 645 churches and monasteries, 15,000 people forced to convert to Islam, 328 churches converted to mosques in another area, 508 more plundered. And this is a letter home, David, from an Ottoman soldier. And he wrote home to his folks, to his brother and to his parents.
And by the way, Robert, I always love these letters from soldiers. I've read a lot of the letters home from Civil War soldiers, right? They're away from home, they're away from their families, and looking, with all this bloodshed and thinking about your family, you really get to focus on what's most important to you, and then send your family a message about all the things that you've really learned about the meaning of life and what's really important. So if you've got a letter home from this time, I mean, this is going to be some great stuff that talks about how wonderful Islam really is. If this guy's had a lot of time to reflect on his religion, go ahead.
"My brother, if you want news from here, we have killed 1,200 Armenians, all of them as food for the dogs. Mother, I am safe and sound. Father, 20 days ago we made war on the Armenian unbelievers." That last word there just puts this in context as to what this is all about. "Through the grace of Allah, no harm befell us. There is a rumor afoot that our battalion will be ordered to your part of the world." So you think, okay, David, you ready? I mean, you figure he's saying we might be sent near home. So he's going to come home, get some of mom's pie, right? And relax with the family. No. "If so, we will kill all the Armenians there."
Wow. Proud father moment.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
So, Robert, here you have a German contemporary
Yes.
writing that hundreds of villages forcibly converted, tons of villages destroyed, tons of Christians forcibly converted, those who refused tortured to death. And what do we have from the Yakin Institute here? Because, you go through examples like this over a period of 1,400 years in your book. It doesn't stop. You go century by century and area by area in your book, giving examples of the things that actually happen. And again, here, the Yakin Institute. "Religious minorities are often depicted as historically oppressed and vulnerable victims of their Muslim rulers. This portrayal, however, is far from accurate." So it's simply inaccurate to portray these Christians who are being forcibly converted or tortured to death, and their places of worship converted to mosques or destroyed. It's just inaccurate to portray them as victims here. It's just inaccurate. Or all the centuries leading up to that, from the time of Muhammad. It's just inaccurate to portray these people as victims of Muslim oppressors.
Here again, the Yakin Institute is depending upon the ignorance of the people it's talking to. And the unfortunate fact is that they can rely on that ignorance, because for the most part, people who read their tweet and liked it or retweeted it, they think they're right. They have no idea. They've been misinformed in school, if they studied it at all, or they've been thoroughly propagandized since then, and they don't have any clue what really happened.
All right. So the average Twitter follower of Dr. Craig Considine probably believes him, right? I would think that many of them actually believe him. They haven't studied anything, and what the heck? He's a doctor. He calls himself a Catholic. So
Craig
obviously,
Constantine is not a Christian. Let's
obviously he has obviously he has no reason whatsoever to make things up in favor of Islam. So he must clearly just be telling the truth here. Whereas the people like Robert Spencer, they must be lying because they have an agenda, not Dr. Craig Considine. So the average Twitter follower of Dr. Considine, or his students who've never studied the history of jihad, who have no, they're regarding him as someone who is knowledgeable, and so they go to him. The average follower, I understand why they think that he's right. But do you think Dr. Considine actually knows better?
Yeah, he must. Either he's a total idiot who doesn't know his own subject, or he's being actively deceptive. So I would rather give him the benefit of the doubt and think he's being actively deceptive, because I don't think he's stupid. But he's not a Christian. He's a Muslim. Let's be very clear about that. He wrote a piece, I have it right here, January 26, 2016, Huffington Post, Why a Christian Can View Muhammad as a Prophet, by Craig Considine. Now, it's full of a lot of tortured reasoning and silliness, but the reality is that the Quran says, far be it from the transcendent majesty of Allah that he should have a son, chapter 19, verse 35. In the first letter of John, in the New Testament, it says anybody who does not have the son does not have the father. So you can't be both a Christian and a Muslim. They are contradictory. They could both be false, but they can't both be true, and one could be true and the other false. But if he thinks Muhammad is a prophet, then he believes in the prophecies Muhammad brought, which deny basic Christian doctrines that are held by all the sects of Christianity. Thus, he cannot be Christian. He must be a Muslim.
So, just to recap that, you've got Dr. Craig Considine claiming to be a Christian who just has a favorable view of Islam, but nevertheless declares that Christians should accept Muhammad as a prophet, even though Muhammad, his revelations contradict core Christian doctrines. In fact, contradict the very core of the Christian gospel, which is a message about Jesus' sacrificial death for sins, his resurrection from the dead, and his divine nature. Islam contradicts those, and therefore, if you accept Muhammad as a prophet, you are thereby rejecting the core teachings of the gospel, and therefore, Craig Considine is saying Christians should accept Muhammad and his refutations of Christianity, but he's a Christian.
He's actively deceptive. I mean, in a certain sense, I understand how Craig Considine calls himself a Christian. Here again, giving him the benefit of the doubt, thinking that he's not an idiot and therefore knows what he's about. He considers himself as a Muslim to be the true Christian because the Quran presents itself as embodying the true teachings of Judaism and Christianity. And of course, in the Quran, all the biblical prophets of the Old Testament and John the Baptist and Jesus are considered Muslims. And the idea is in Islam that it was the followers of Moses and David and Solomon and John the Baptist and Jesus who twisted and hijacked their Islamic teachings to create what we know of as Judaism and Christianity. So as a follower of the true teachings of Jesus, which are in the Quran, Considine considers himself a Christian. But to say he's a Catholic it's just deceptive, because that is identifying himself with a specific Christian sect, and there's no sense in which he could possibly be a Catholic and affirm what the Catholic Church teaches while also affirming what Muhammad taught as prophecies.
Yeah, I'm thinking that, or because I don't know a lot about him, I'm thinking the other interpretation here would be that he's just so incredibly liberal with what he means by Christian that he just doesn't take any of the basic doctrines seriously, and probably doesn't take the basic doctrines of Islam seriously. And so if you don't take any of these core doctrines seriously, then Well, you know,
Call yourself
why shouldn't you regard Muhammad as a prophet?
yeah,
I mean, after all he did was bring peace to the world.
it's being nice,
Yeah.
and we all have to be nice.
All right. Well, we're pretty much out of time here, so I just wanted to point out that the situation that we have, and the reason we're doing this is, guys, think about how prevalent this is right now in our world. I just had to make a video because the leaders of the Women's March are claiming that Muhammad was a feminist. Right now, that is so beyond ridiculous that you wonder how they can say it with a straight face, how they are not immediately called out on it. Instead, they are praised. They are praised for telling the truth about Muhammad, and those of us who actually respond are bigots and Islamophobes for pointing out basic facts which show that's absolute nonsense. So anywhere you go across the board, Islam is being just flat out misrepresented and lied about in order to promote it to a Western audience. And the people who
hijacking Islam,
yeah, the people who dare say, let's actually look at what the Quran says. Let's look at what we find in the Hadith. Let's look at the life of Muhammad. Let's look at the work of the rightly guided caliphs. Let's go down through the various caliphates down through history from the time of Muhammad down to the present to show that what these people are saying is absolute nonsense. And when we do that, we're called bigots and racists, and we just have an agenda for doing that. This is a very, very sad world that we're living in right now. Very dangerous place. And so I'm glad we have people like Robert Spencer doing a really, really painful, horrible job that gets you nothing but abuse, because someone needs to do it. Just do it because someone needs to do it.
David, telling the truth is it's easy. You know, you don't have to have as good a memory as liars do, and it's my honor to be able to tell the truth. A lot of people don't have. It seems astonishing to me, the lack of courage in the world today. So just to stand for the truth, it's what all of us should be doing. Mm-hmm. And I commend you, sir, for your courage and great wit in doing so.
Well, I'm a psychopath, so I understand why I do it. I just don't understand why people without massive mental defects do it. This is some rough stuff.
Maybe I have them. Maybe I should go in and get checked.
All right, Robert. So you can go ahead and close out by telling people what they can do. So they just heard about tons of misrepresentation, distortion, and I mean it is systematic, organized misrepresentation, distortion by politicians, the media, educators, Hollywood. Everyone is giving one consistent message about Islam being wonderful, and the people here, they've actually got a chance to look at some history. What can they do to respond to this? Because we're kind of outnumbered and outgunned here.
No, the truth is never outnumbered or outgunned. Remember Solzhenitsyn, David. Solzhenitsyn, the great Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the great dissident from the Soviet Union. He was in the Gulag. He wrote the Gulag Archipelago. He compared living in a totalitarian regime to being a blade of grass that gets paved over by concrete, and everything goes dark and you can't breathe, and it seems as if you're totally under their control and totally within their power. But we've all seen blades of grass poke through the broken concrete. And that's what we all need to do, is to persist, to tell the truth in season and out of season, to challenge these people like Considine and the Yaqeen Institute wherever and whenever we can. Certainly, courteously, respectfully, all of these things, but always tell the truth, stand for the truth, be a blade of grass, and break through the concrete. The concrete never will prevail.
Mm-hmm. All right, and thank you, Robert. And again, for those of you out there, and there are still over 800 who are here live with us, if you didn't get the book, there's a link in the description box. There's a link to Robert's website, so follow his website. If you don't have the book, get the book. Even if you're looking at that book going, I don't really want to know that much about the history of jihad. I don't need that much information.
Yeah, you do.
If you want, just get the book and read the first chapter. Learn the first chapter well. Even if you don't want to read the rest of the book, I would recommend reading the rest of the book, because the rest of the book is what even people who deal with Islam a lot don't know, because we tend to focus on the life of Muhammad, or we tend to focus on the present. We ignore all those centuries in the middle. Robert goes through all of those centuries, century by century, showing what happened in those centuries. But even if you don't want that 14, because people have various degrees of interest in the subject and have varying amounts of time that they can dedicate to the subject. So even if you don't want to go through all of the history, learn the first chapter well. That's the life of Muhammad. Learn the first chapter well. That's the life of Muhammad. Puts it all together, historical form, and you see where this all begins. So be sure to get that book. Learn at least the first chapter, but go through the entire book if you can. And we will see you all next time. God bless everyone, even you atheists.